And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm meteorologist David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining for our marine forecast. Taking a look at our ice edge, ice farther to the north as expected this time of year, and continuing to see melting from Utqiagvik out east towards Kaktovik along the coast there. Looking at some of our Monday weather in terms of what we're going to expect for aviation, low pressure out over the Bering Sea continuing to bring rain to areas of the Bering Sea and the marine areas along the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. We also expect a little bit stronger winds with this low, so southerly winds on the eastern side and westerly winds on the southern side of the low. Looking out over the Gulf of Alaska, however, dominated by high pressure, we would expect some lighter winds throughout areas of the northern Gulf and out closer towards the Panhandle as well. Moving into Tuesday, pretty similar pattern, still dominated by high pressure out over the Gulf of Alaska, so expecting some relatively weaker winds for areas around the Gulf. And as we move back out towards the Aleutians, low pressure drifting a little bit farther to the south is going to bring some easterly winds to the north of that low, some southerly winds as we get into the Alaska Peninsula area, and some northerly winds on the west side of that low for the western Aleutian Islands. Taking a look now at the marine forecast, starting off in southeast Alaska, we are expecting lighter easterly winds around 10 knots out over the eastern Gulf. And the inside water is pretty light there as well, 10 to 15 knots, strongest in the south with a somewhat southeasterly direction. Then on Tuesday, a pretty similar flow, southeasterly direction in the inside waters, 10 knots for most of the areas, a little bit stronger as we get farther to the south, and 10 knots throughout the eastern Gulf. Taking a look now at south central, in the northern portions of the Gulf, westerly flow around 15 knots, dropping down to 10 knots in Prince William Sound. Out over Cook Inlet area, southwesterly winds around 10 knots expected there, and 15 knots out of a southeasterly direction around the Barren Islands. Then on Tuesday, seeing some lighter winds around 10 knots, variable directions in the northern Gulf. Around the Barren Islands, southeasterly winds, 15 knots expected there. And as we move into Cook Inlet, south to southwest, out of a light 10 knots. As we look out over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island on Monday, starting at Kodiak Island, southeasterly winds 15 knots there. Then out for the Alaska Peninsula, 15 to 20 knots with a southeasterly component. On Tuesday, picking up a little bit, especially on the Bering side, 20 to 25 knots out of a southeasterly direction and 15 to 20 knots on the Pacific side. Out for Kodiak Island, 15 knots out of a southeast direction. As we look out over the Aleutian Islands on Monday, for the central and eastern Aleutians, southwesterly flow around 20 knots. Then out by the western Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots out of a northwesterly direction. On Tuesday, getting a little bit stronger by the western Aleutian Islands, northwesterly winds 20 to 25 knots. And then for the central Aleutian Islands, southwesterly winds 15 knots, becoming more southeasterly 15 to 20 knots as we approach the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast, we're going to see winds north of Nunavik Island, 15 to 20 knots out of an easterly direction. Weaker there in Norton Sound, only around 10 knots. South of Nunavik Island, going to see easterly winds 25 knots. And out of some of the gaps around Bristol Bay, we are going to see gusts up to 35 knots. Out by St. Matthew Island, easterly winds 25 knots expected. And by the Pribilof Islands, southerly winds 15 knots expected. Then on Tuesday, dropping down north of Nunavik Island, 10 to 15 knots out of an easterly direction. South of Nunavik Island, easterly around 25 knots. St. Matthew Island, going to see northeasterly winds 20 knots. And then the Pribilof Islands, easterly winds 15 knots. Up along the Arctic coast, northeasterly component to the winds, 15 knots, picking up to 20 knots out by Wainwright, and then dropping down to 10 knots out of a more southwesterly direction as we approach the Bering Strait. On Tuesday, along the Arctic coastline, easterly winds 10 knots around Utqiagvik, picking up all the way to 20 knots as we get closer towards Kaktovik, and then really light flow, only around 5 knots as we get down the west coast towards the Bering Strait. For Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.